They say old men talk too much because silence starts to resemble death. I suppose that's true. I've found myself speaking more in the last 3 years than I did in the previous 10, even if no one's around to listen. The words come like water from a broken pipe, flooding the air of my small house in southern Arizona. There's no one to mop it up, no one to tell me to hush or to ask me to repeat myself. I live alone now, in a house I once built, with the help of my brother-in-law, brick by brick, back when my hands didn't shake, and my back didn't ache just from standing too long. I'm 82 years old. My name is Wallace Jerome Harlan. I used to be an English teacher at the local high school, the kind of teacher kids would roll their eyes at for assigning too many essays and quoting Shakespeare when someone acted out in class. I wore cardigans and always smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, even after I quit smoking. I had a reputation for being stern but fair. That was decades ago. They don't talk about me much at the school anymore. Retired faculty disappear fast in the world of education. Retired people disappear fast in general, come to think of it. My wife Elaine passed away 5 years ago. Cancer, the cruel kind, the kind that doesn't shout, but whispers, slowly eroding the body and then the spirit. She was everything I'm not. Warm, patient, full of quiet joy. Her laugh could disarm any room. I used to believe that her presence protected me from bitterness, that as long as she stood beside me, I wouldn't become one of those old men who sit on porches and bark about politics and the price of bread. Without her, something in me tilted off balance. I began to notice the cracks in everything, the way the sun faded the curtains unevenly, the creak in the floorboards that no one ever fixed, the dust that settled faster than it used to, as though time had begun to speed up the process of decay now. That Elaine was gone. Our son, Calvin, lives just 30 minutes away in Mesa with his wife, Tasha, and their 2 boys, ages 12 and 15. I used to think that proximity meant something, that it implied a kind of closeness, that being nearby was a precursor to being present. I was wrong. Calvin and I were never the affectionate kind. We didn't hug after he turned 10, and our phone calls were more like brief news bulletins than conversations. "Hi, Dad. We're all fine. Just busy. You know how it is." Tasha would occasionally chime in from the background with a "Hi, Wallace," like an afterthought. The boys, I couldn't even say what grade they're in anymore. I sent them books for Christmas and their birthdays, but I never received a thank you, not even a text. I don't blame them. I've become a shadow in their lives, an old photograph in the hallway they pass without glancing at. The last time Calvin visited was for Elaine's funeral. He arrived late in a wrinkled shirt, looking vaguely irritated. He gave me a side hug and said, "You holding up okay, Dad?" I nodded. That was our entire exchange. During the wake, I watched him from across the room. He stood by the buffet table, balancing a plate of deviled eggs, chatting with the pastor about refinancing his mortgage. Tasha sat beside me for a few minutes, flipping through the Elaine's photo album and making polite noises. "She always looked so elegant," she said. "You must miss her terribly." I didn't answer. What could I say that would mean anything to someone like her? I loved my wife. I missed her like a lung misses air. And yet, in that room full of people, I felt the first chill of irrelevance, the first taste of being a relic, something to be honored in passing but not engaged with. After Elaine's passing, Calvin started suggesting things. At first, they were framed as questions. Have you ever thought about moving into a senior community, Dad? Wouldn't it be nice to be around other people your age? You wouldn't have to worry about groceries or mowing the lawn anymore. I always answered politely, no, thank you. I prefer my independence. But over time, the questions hardened into suggestions, and the suggestions began to feel like instructions. He once showed up with brochures, glossy things with smiling gray-haired couples playing tennis and sipping wine. They even have poetry nights, he said, as if that would somehow tempt me. I told him I wasn't ready. He looked at me like I had refused a life raft. What he didn't understand, and what most people don't, is that independence isn't just about doing your own laundry or cooking your own meals. It's about owning your space, your decisions, your dignity. I still drove to the grocery store every Wednesday morning. I still paid my own bills and read the newspaper with my morning coffee. I still kept a vegetable garden in the backyard, even if my knees complained about it. Every tomato I harvested was a small rebellion against the idea that I should already be folding into myself, fading quietly into obsolescence. But Calvin and Tasha had already decided otherwise. I heard it in the pauses between their words. I saw it in the way they looked at me during the rare dinners we shared. Tasha once said, "You're still living here alone? That can't be safe." Safe. As if the walls of my own home had turned against me, as if my life, my routines, my solitude were somehow a ticking bomb. Well, you're not getting any younger, she added with a smile, the kind that's meant to sound kind but lands like a slap. I laughed it off, but I knew what was coming. They were preparing the narrative, gently at first, like setting the stage for an intervention. I wasn't dying fast enough for their plans. That's what I came to believe. And then there were the financial hints. Have you updated your will recently, Dad? Do you still have that annuity? What happens to the house if something happens to you? I'd answer vaguely, dodge the specifics. Elaine and I had lived modestly, saved carefully. We never splurged on cruises or new cars. Our home was paid off. There were no debts. I didn't live lavishly, but I lived securely. And apparently that security had become attractive. Not as a comfort for me in old age, but as a potential windfall for them. I began to feel the way a tree must feel in the final seasons before the saw, useful only for what it can offer once felled. I caught them once, whispering on the porch when they thought I was asleep. He's slowing down, Tasha said. He probably won't last much longer, Calvin responded. I just hope he gets the paperwork sorted before something happens. Something. That word clanged in my ears for weeks. Not death, not illness, something. A catch-all placeholder for the end they had already pre-written for me. They had planned out a future without me, down to the color of the walls in their new living room, once they sold my house. I wish I could say I confronted them. I wish I could say I stood up and shouted that I was still here, still capable, still worthy of more than their whispered timelines. But I didn't. I went back to bed and stared at the ceiling, tracing the cracks with my eyes, listening to my own heartbeat thud against the betrayal. I felt a slow shift inside me that night. Not just pain, not just grief, but something colder, sharper, a resolve forming like ice. They thought I should already be dead, but I wasn't. I was still here. And before I left this world, I would remind them who I was. It started with a fall. Not a dramatic one, not the kind that ends with sirens and concerned nurses. Just a simple misstep in the backyard, a twist of the ankle on a loose paving stone, the kind of accident that happens to anyone, regardless of age. But when you're 82, every fall is treated like a prophecy. I limped back inside, cursing under my breath, sat down at the kitchen table, and elevated my foot with a bag of frozen peas, telling myself it would pass. The swelling was mild, no bruising, no sharp pain, but the phone call I made to Calvin, just to inform him, not to worry him, set off a chain of events I didn't expect. He arrived that evening, alone. Tasha, he said, had a migraine. He sat across from me, arms folded, lips tight, surveying me like a building inspector, looking for cracks in the foundation. I told him the fall wasn't serious, that I'd been more embarrassed than hurt. He didn't laugh. "Dad, you can't keep pretending like you're still 60, he said, and there was no affection in his tone, only a mild exasperation, like he was talking to a stubborn client. "These things escalate. One day it's a twisted ankle, the next it's a broken hip. We both know how that goes." I said nothing, sipping my lukewarm coffee, trying not to wince when I shifted my foot. He glanced around the house, took in the scattered books on the table, the dust on the mantel, the unopened mail by the door. "You're falling behind," he observed. "You used to be so tidy." It wasn't meant as cruelty, I think, just an inventory of decline. But to me it landed like an accusation. You used to be better. You used to be worth more. Then came the suggestion, a nurse, part-time, just to check in, make sure I was taking my pills, that the house was safe. Not permanent, just a precaution. I declined. "Dad, this isn't about pride," he said. "It's about practicality. Tasha and I can't drop everything every time you forget to turn off the stove or slip in the shower." I stared at him. I didn't forget the stove. I didn't slip in the shower. I tripped on a rock. "Still," he replied, shrugging, "these are signs." That word again. Signs, as if my body was a roadmap of inevitable failure, every ache and mistake, a milestone toward oblivion. That was when I began to feel the shift, the slow tightening of a noose I hadn't noticed until now. Calvin didn't see me anymore. He saw a liability, a man-shaped bundle of risks and future paperwork. He returned the next day, with Tasha this time. She brought banana bread, store-bought, in a plastic container and placed it on the counter like an offering. She kissed my cheek with the sterile politeness of someone greeting a distant relative at a wedding. We sat in the living room. They flanked me like bookends, one on each side. There was no small talk. "We've been thinking," Calvin said, "it might be time to consider long-term arrangements." I looked at him. "What arrangements?" "You're alone here, Dad," Tasha chimed in. "This house is too big. It's not safe, not practical. What if you fall and no one finds you for days? It was one fall, I said. I'm fine. You say that now, Calvin replied. But what about next time? They had pamphlets this time, not just brochures, folders, printed spreadsheets, comparing costs and amenities. You'd have your own space, Tasha assured me. Your own bathroom, meals provided, laundry, activities. Like a prison, I muttered. She bristled. It's not like that at all. These places are beautiful, resort-style living, and it's not permanent, just until we figure out what's best. I wanted to laugh. What's best, as if there was a vote and I'd missed it, as if my future was a community decision and I hadn't been invited to the meeting. I looked at the papers, the columns of numbers, the glossy photos of gray-haired couples painting birdhouses. And what happens to the house? I asked quietly. They paused. Well, Calvin said, too quickly. That's the other thing. We spoke to a realtor. You'd get a good price, especially if you sell now. We could handle everything. There it was, the catch, the part they'd tiptoed around. They needed the house. Not for me, for them, for debt, for renovation, for some new life that required tearing down mine. Tasha leaned forward, her voice syrupy. We'd make sure you're comfortable. You wouldn't have to worry about a thing. I stood up slowly, my foot still tender. I'm not ready, I said. I don't want to live in a place where they check on me every hour like a child. Dad, Calvin began, but I raised a hand. Not yet, I said, and not like this. They left soon after, the banana bread untouched on the counter. That night, I walked through every room of the house. I ran my hand along the bookshelves I had built myself. I stood in the kitchen where Elaine used to hum while chopping vegetables. I sat on the edge of our bed and looked at the indentation her body had left on the mattress. This was my life, my kingdom, and they wanted me to sign it away in exchange for bingo nights and beige hallways. A week later, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from a lawyer. My name on the envelope. Inside, a formal document requesting my signature to assign Calvin as my financial power of attorney. For your convenience, the letter read, also to help with banking, insurance, and medical decisions in the event of an emergency. I stared at the paper for a long time. No call beforehand, no conversation. Just a signature line and a pen enclosed in the envelope, like they assumed I'd just go along with it. Like it was already decided. I didn't sign it. I didn't even call to acknowledge it. I folded the paper neatly, returned it to the envelope, and slid it into the drawer with the rest of the things I wasn't ready to deal with. But something inside me hardened that day. Something permanent. They wanted me out of the way. Out of the house. Out of their hands. They thought I was slipping. That my days were numbered. That my mind was dull. And my instincts slow. But I saw them clearly now. I saw the plans drawn in pencil, ready to be inked the moment I gave up. I saw their future with me cut out of the picture. I understood what they wanted, but they hadn't asked what I wanted. And that, I decided, would be their mistake. They believed I was already halfway in the grave, but they didn't know how much fire still burned beneath my quiet exterior. They didn't know that I wasn't finished yet, not with them, and not with what was mine. They had mistaken my stillness for surrender. They were wrong, and I would prove it. I decided not to confront them directly, not yet. There's something about silence that unnerves people far more than shouting ever could. So I played along. I smiled when Calvin called. I let Tasha drop off little casseroles and vitamin bottles as if she were doing me a favor. I even allowed a woman named Mira, a wellness visitor from the local senior advocacy center, to come by once a week to check on my well-being. I never told them that I knew she was sent by Tasha. Myra was kind enough, with careful eyes and hands that touched everything. My pill organizer, my fridge, my mailbox. She always left with some little observation. You should think about labeling your medications more clearly, Mr. Harlan, or it's time to change the batteries in your smoke detector. I nodded and thanked her, then wrote down everything she noticed and how often she came. I started a journal. At the top of every page, I wrote the same sentence. They think I'm slipping. I began to collect evidence. I requested copies of my bank statements, ordered my credit reports, printed out a full account history from my utilities. I organized my insurance papers, my tax records, even the old warranty documents for the water heater. Every shred of paperwork that said I was competent, functional, and not in need of their intervention went into a heavy brown accordion folder I labeled Survival. I made an appointment with a lawyer, not the one they had used for that power of attorney form, but a woman named Nadine, who had been recommended to me by a retired colleague from the school district. Nadine was sharp, probably mid-40s, with a no-nonsense tone and a firm handshake. I told her everything, not in a rant, but calmly, as if I were reciting a well-structured essay. She listened without interruption, occasionally jotting down notes. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "You're not the first. You won't be the last, but you might be one of the rare ones who fight back before it's too late." That phrase stayed with me. Before it's too late, before they took more than just my house and my accounts, before they stole my name, my autonomy, my right to decide what happens to me. Nadine helped me draft a new power of attorney, one that placed authority in the hands of an independent fiduciary, someone with no personal ties or potential conflicts of interest. She also began reviewing my estate plan to ensure that Calvin and Tasha couldn't maneuver around me legally. I didn't remove them entirely from the will. I'm not vindictive. But I made sure that if anything ever did happen to me, my assets would be protected from mismanagement. She encouraged me to undergo a full medical and cognitive evaluation with a licensed geriatric specialist. "It's better to have that on file now," she said, "than to scramble later." That visit was one of the strangest experiences I've ever had. Sitting in a sterile room with a clipboard in my lap, answering questions like, "What year is it?" and "Who is the president?" made me feel like I was on trial for being old. But I passed with flying colors. My mind was still sharp, my memory intact, my reasoning skills unimpaired. I took the report embossed with the clinic seal and added it to my survival folder. One more piece of proof that I was still me, still in charge. Then came the pills. That was the moment when all doubt evaporated. Tasha arrived one afternoon with a new prescription bottle. "Just something to help with sleep and memory," she said casually. setting it down on my nightstand. I asked where it came from. "Our family doctor," she replied. "He specializes in geriatric care now." I looked at the label. No familiar pharmacy name. The doctor's name didn't ring a bell. The pills were large and oval-shaped, pale green. I didn't touch them. Instead, I placed the bottle in a drawer and later took it to a local pharmacist, a man I'd known for years. He examined the contents and furrowed his brow. "These aren't for sleep," he said. "They're antipsychotics. Very strong. Can cause disorientation, muscle tremors, even memory loss in some older adults." I felt my stomach turn. Whether Tasha knew what she was giving me or not, I couldn't say, but the implications were clear. If I had taken those pills daily, and if Calvin and Tasha were keeping track of my behavior, it wouldn't have taken long before I truly did seem impaired, dazed, confused, dependent. That night I sat in my recliner staring at the fireplace and made a decision. I wasn't going to wait anymore. I wasn't going to sit quietly and hope their ambitions would fade. This was no longer about maintaining independence. It was about survival, not just physical, but moral. I wouldn't allow them to erase me in order to write a more convenient story. The next morning, I visited the bank and opened a new account in a different institution entirely. I moved the majority of my savings there and instructed Nadine to begin the process of transferring ownership of the house into a trust with strict distribution terms. Calvin and Tasha would still inherit, eventually, but only under conditions that guaranteed they could never touch the house or its value while I was alive. I sent them a brief message later that week. "Thank you for your concern," I wrote, "but I've decided to handle my affairs independently from now on. Please do not bring unsolicited medications into my home. Any further involvement in my health or finances must be cleared with my attorney." I expected anger, or at least protest. But all I received was a curt reply: "Understood. If you change your mind, we're here." The silence that followed wasn't peace. It was strategy. I knew they hadn't given up. They were regrouping. There were subtle signs. My neighbor told me someone had asked questions about whether I lived alone and whether I'd been seen walking unsteadily. A call came to the school board office, an anonymous inquiry about whether I'd ever shown signs of dementia while teaching. I found a small, unmarked car parked outside my house for several days in a row, always gone before nightfall. It could have been nothing, or it could have been a prelude. I wasn't afraid. I was resolved. The more they pushed, the more I prepared. I hired a financial advisor. I documented every interaction with Calvin and Tasha. I even installed security cameras around the house, not for burglars, but for clarity. I wanted everything recorded, time-stamped, verifiable. If they were going to accuse me of incompetence, they'd have to do it while I was holding a receipt in one hand and a notarized affidavit in the other. They wanted to control the story, to shape my final chapter into something manageable, something that justified their entitlement. But I would not be a character in their narrative. I was the author of my own ending, and I intended to write every word myself. It was a Thursday morning when the real break came, not just a shift in tone or a suspicion confirmed, but a full collapse of the fragile pretense that Calvin and Tasha had maintained over the past months. I received a letter, not an email or a phone call, but a printed envelope slid into my mailbox like something smuggled through a back channel. It bore the return address of a law office I didn't recognize, somewhere downtown. I opened it at the kitchen table with a trembling hand, not from fear, but from the weariness of anticipation. I had known something was coming, but I hadn't expected this. Inside was a formal legal document, a petition for guardianship. Calvin was filing for full legal authority over my person and estate, citing mental decline, impaired judgment, and increasingly erratic behavior. I read the words slowly, deliberately, each sentence hitting like a stone through a window. They claimed I had been leaving food to rot, wandering outside in inappropriate clothing, and confusing appointments and people. Tasha had signed a supporting affidavit stating she had found me unable to manage simple conversations and increasingly paranoid and verbally aggressive. There were no dates, no evidence, just declarations, broad strokes of character assassination masked in clinical language. For a moment I sat in silence, the paper trembling in my hand. Then I stood, walked calmly to the cabinet above the refrigerator, and pulled out the brown accordion folder. I spread the contents across the kitchen table like a general preparing for war. Medical reports, legal filings, financial statements, video stills from the cameras I had installed, a journal with entries detailing every interaction, every anomaly, every attempt they had made to manipulate or sedate me. If they wanted a war in court, I was ready to oblige them. I called Nadine that afternoon and told her what had arrived. She asked me to bring everything. "We'll file a countersuit," she said, "but we'll do one better. We'll prove malicious intent." That evening, as the sun set over the desert hills, I made tea and stood on my porch, watching the light bleed out of the sky. I wasn't afraid. I was done with fear. What I felt now was clarity, a kind of fierce, quiet rage that had no need for yelling. The line had been crossed. There would be no going back. The court hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later. During that time, I didn't hear from Calvin or Tasha, not a word. They had made their move and were waiting for me to fall into place, waiting for the system to do their dirty work, to rubber stamp the image they had painted of me, a confused, bitter old man who had become a danger to himself. But what they didn't understand was that while they were planning my funeral, in all but name, I had been digging into their lives with the same meticulous precision they had tried to use against me. I found the loan documents. I found the credit card statements. I found the second mortgage they had taken out on their home in Mesa and the foreclosure notices that had begun to arrive 2 months earlier. Their debts were mounting, their financial house collapsing, and they needed mine to survive. I was never the problem. I was the solution, or at least I was supposed to be. That was the true insult, not just that they had betrayed me, but that they had done so not out of genuine fear or misguided concern, but for money. It was always about money. The house, the annuity, the savings, all of it just numbers in their ledger. The day of the hearing, I wore a dark blue suit that Elaine had once complimented for making me look like a senator. Nadine met me outside the courthouse. She looked at me with the faintest trace of a smile. "They don't know "What's coming?" she said. We sat across from Calvin and Tasha in the courtroom, and I saw something in their eyes that I hadn't seen before. Not arrogance or pity, but discomfort, maybe even guilt. They had expected me to show up meek, confused, shuffling in with a cane and a dazed expression. Instead, I sat upright, my eyes clear, my hands still. When the judge asked me to speak, I didn't hesitate. I told the truth, calmly, plainly, without theatrics. I explained the pills, the unsolicited visits, the attempt to manipulate my finances, the forged narratives of decline. Nadine submitted the reports, the surveillance footage, the signed documents. The judge asked a few sharp questions. Tasha stammered through her answers. Calvin looked at the floor. When it was over, the petition was denied. More than denied, the judge admonished them for their inappropriate and unsupported actions and warned that any further attempts to gain guardianship without medical cause would be treated as harassment. I walked out of that courtroom not just free, but vindicated. I was not losing my mind. I had not imagined the plot. It was real, and now it was on record. Outside, Calvin tried to speak to me. I didn't stop walking. I didn't even turn my head. Tasha called my name once, a hollow sound that rang against the courthouse steps. I kept going. Not out of triumph. I felt no joy in winning. Not really. What I felt was the end of something that should never have begun. A funeral had taken place that day after all. Not mine, but theirs. The final burial of the idea that we were still a family. In the weeks following the court hearing, the silence from Calvin and Tasha was almost comical in its persistence. There were no more texts, no carefully phrased voicemails pretending concern, no check-ins or veiled questions from mutual acquaintances. It was as if they had hit a wall and vanished into their own shame. But I knew better. People like them don't simply stop. They pause, regroup, recalibrate. They return, usually smarter, more desperate, and more dangerous. I kept going about my life with quiet vigilance. I didn't change my routine, but I watched closely for what might be next. And next, as it turned out, came not from the front door, but through a digital side alley I had almost forgotten existed. It began with an overdraft notice from the bank. One of the old accounts, a secondary one I had opened years ago for minor purchases and subscription fees, showed a large withdrawal I hadn't made. At first, I assumed it was a clerical error. I visited the bank, requested the details, and saw a name on the transfer, Calvin Harlan. The account, though small, still had enough funds to matter, and he had drained it nearly to the last cent, using a duplicate card I didn't even know existed. I filed a fraud report, froze the account, and asked for an internal audit. The manager, a kindly woman who had known me since Elaine and I first opened a joint savings account back in the 70s, looked genuinely heartbroken. "I'll escalate this," she said. "It might take time, but we'll get to the bottom of it." A week later, I got a call from Nadine. "You're not going to believe this," she said, and proceeded to read a formal letter addressed to the county office. A request for a reevaluation of your mental competence based on new developments. She paused. They're citing behavior that suggests cognitive instability and referencing a recent financial misstep, namely an overdraft. They're building a pattern, Wallace. I felt it like a punch in the chest, not because of the tactics. I had expected something like this, but because of the pettiness of it. They weren't trying to win with truth. They were trying to fabricate reality brick by brick until someone in power accepted the false structure as solid. It made me think of a story Elaine once told me about a relative who faked a sickness for years to keep a job that had otherwise passed him by. If you lie long enough, she'd said, you either get caught or start to believe it. Either way, the damage is done. I wondered which route Calvin and Tasha were on now. Were they still playing a game? Or had they convinced themselves that I was the villain in their story? That I was a deluded, stubborn old man, refusing help? Hoarding money they believed should already belong to them? I wasn't about to let them write the ending. I called Nadine the next day and told her I wanted to escalate. I want them cut off, not just legally, but morally. I want their behavior documented, preserved, exposed. She understood immediately. We began gathering statements from my doctor, from my neighbors, from local vendors who had interacted with me regularly. Each described me as lucid, polite, methodical. I wasn't trying to paint a perfect portrait. I wanted the truth, and the truth was on my side. Nadine also suggested something I hadn't considered, a private investigator. If they're trying to manipulate systems and narratives, she said, we need to know what they're doing when they think no one's watching. It felt strange hiring someone to watch my own son. But by that point, Calvin wasn't just my son. He was a man conspiring against me. If he had been a stranger, I'd have reported him without hesitation. Blood doesn't excuse betrayal. The investigator, a lean, quiet man in his early 50s named Harris, began surveillance immediately. Within days, he had photos, recordings, even bank activity that painted a grim picture. Calvin was drowning in debt, mortgage defaults, payday loans, mounting credit card balances. Tasha's boutique business had shuttered 6 months earlier, something they had never mentioned. Their car had been repossessed, and yet they had continued to dine at expensive restaurants, take weekend trips, and maintain the illusion of stability. The pieces clicked into place. Their desperation wasn't sudden. It had been building quietly, like mold behind wallpaper. Then came the most damning detail. Harris had uncovered a recent meeting between Calvin and a man known locally for facilitating shady financial arrangements, quick loans, title transfers, even fraudulent disability claims. Calvin had brought documents. Harris couldn't photograph the papers directly, but his audio recorder caught enough. Calvin was attempting to transfer assets he didn't yet own. He was offering my house, my home, as leverage for a future deal. He was betting on my removal, legally or physically, to fund his comeback. I sat in my study that night, listening to the audio file with headphones. I heard my son's voice, calm, businesslike, describing the house, its square footage, its market value. I heard him say, once it's under my name, I can move on this immediately. The other man asked, and your father? Is he on board? And Calvin replied, he won't be an issue much longer. It's a strange thing hearing your own death implied in such casual terms, not death by disease or time, but death as an obstacle being cleared. I didn't feel anger. Not at first. I felt cold, hollowed out, like someone had reached into my chest and scraped away what was left of the paternal bond. Whatever faint hope had lingered in me, that Calvin might one day wake up, regret, apologize, was extinguished in that moment. But I didn't break. I didn't collapse. I printed a transcript, added it to the folder, and poured myself a glass of brandy. I looked around the house, the framed photos of Elaine, the worn copy of The Old Man and the Sea on the coffee table, the grandfather clock she'd bought me for our 30th anniversary, and thought, you won't take this from me. Not 1 inch. The next morning I called Nadine. I want to initiate the preemptive inheritance block, I said, and I want to revoke any remaining transfer rights Calvin may have. I don't care if it's just his name on a spam letter or a forgotten document from a decade ago. I want him completely severed. She didn't hesitate. It'll be done. By the following week, the trust had been amended, the house secured beyond contestation, and a civil restraining order was filed, barring Calvin and Tasha from entering the property without express permission. Harris also delivered a final report. Calvin had contacted a second attorney, one who specialized in elder care disputes. He was preparing to argue undue influence, that I had been manipulated by Nadine, by doctors, by unfamiliar parties, seeking to alienate me from my family. It was the most audacious move yet, to accuse others of the very thing he himself had been doing for months. That's when I decided it wasn't enough to defend. I had to counterattack, not out of vengeance, but for clarity, for history, for justice. I drafted a formal letter, signed and notarized, and mailed it to Calvin's address. It read, in part, you are no longer welcome on my property, in my financial affairs, or in my future. You have violated the basic trust between a parent and child. This is not a punishment, it is a boundary. You may choose to rebuild your life without me, or you may continue down the path you've chosen. But know this, I am not afraid of you, and I will not protect you from the consequences of your own decisions. 3 days later, I received a text, not from Calvin, but from his younger son, Owen. Grandpa, is it true what Dad's saying, that you've gone crazy and someone's taking your money? I stared at the screen, my hands trembling, not with weakness, but with something more painful. The first poison drop, reaching the next generation. I typed back, no, Owen, I am fine. Ask questions. Read everything. Someday you'll understand. He didn't reply. I didn't expect him to. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for my own life. I was fighting to preserve the truth, not only for the court or the community or for some legal record, but for memory itself, for what my name would mean when I was gone, for what Elaine and I built, and what would remain after. And I was not done yet. The moment of reckoning did not arrive with a thunderclap or a dramatic knock at the door. It came with an envelope. One final, unassuming envelope slid through the mail slot on a morning when the desert wind was unusually still and the air smelled faintly of creosote and dry earth. The return address was familiar, the office of the county clerk. I had known this was coming. Nadine had warned me. The last legal volley had landed. Calvin and Tasha had filed an emergency injunction, one last desperate attempt to obtain legal conservatorship over me, now framed as an act of protective intervention, citing what they called emotional volatility, social isolation, and the growing presence of manipulative external actors. They had even named Nadine in the filing, alleging that she was exerting undue influence and pressuring Wallace into decisions contrary to his best interest. It was an astonishing document, full of fabricated incidents, misquoted neighbors, and references to obscure legal precedents that read more like internet searches than actual research. But the most galling part was the declaration from Calvin himself, sworn under penalty of perjury, stating that I was in the final stages of cognitive decline and had exhibited clear signs of detachment from reality. I read it once, twice, then a third time slower. My son had lied under oath, not just exaggerated, lied. Nadine arrived within the hour. She read the papers without comment, her expression a mask of concentration. Then she looked at me and said, "It's time to end this, not just defend. We move for full counter-litigation, slander, harassment, malicious prosecution. We're not going to keep waiting for them to stop. We're going to stop them." I nodded slowly. "Do it," I said. The days that followed were not cinematic. There was no swelling music, no montage of strategy and righteous fury. There were emails, documents, affidavits, depositions, hours of work, legal, emotional, mental, to prepare for the final confrontation. I met again with the geriatric specialist who had examined me 6 months earlier. This time I brought letters from my former students, now adults, who described in detailed, articulate paragraphs the conversations we had in recent months, the way I remembered dates, names, even obscure literature references. I filmed myself doing mundane things, gardening, cooking, balancing a checkbook, repairing a loose hinge on the shed door. Not because I needed proof for myself, but because I knew that when truth becomes suspect, even the ordinary must be documented. The hearing was scheduled for Thursday. I woke early that morning, not out of nerves, but because I had not truly slept. I put on the same blue suit I had worn at the first hearing, not for superstition, but for continuity. Nadine picked me up just after 8. We didn't talk much on the drive. The courthouse stood quiet against the morning sun, and I felt no fear as we walked up the steps. Inside, the same judge presided, a stern woman with a sharp mind and an even sharper memory. She remembered the previous case. She even greeted me by name, not as a formality, but as recognition. Calvin and Tasha were already seated. He looked thinner, more worn. She looked hardened, almost defiant. They did not greet me. Their attorney, a sharp-suited man with a practiced frown, stood to present their case. It was a dramatic performance. He spoke of a father lost to paranoia, manipulated by a rogue advisor, estranged from his family due to supposed past wounds. He painted me as erratic, angry, dangerous to myself. He cited bank transfers, my refusal to let family visit, and what he described as disturbing behavior patterns, though he failed to offer a single, specific, verifiable example. When he finished, he sat down with the look of a man who thought he had just delivered a killing blow. Then Nadine stood. She began without raising her voice, without pacing or posturing. She simply laid out facts, cold, clean, devastating. She introduced Harris's report, the audio recordings of Calvin discussing the house, the evidence of forged documentation, the suspicious withdrawals. She submitted the signed statements of my physician, my neighbors, my pastor. She showed video clips of me preparing my taxes, reading aloud from Tolstoy, fixing the lock on the back gate. And then she addressed the most damning part of the petition, the claim that I was losing touch with reality. "Your Honor," she said, "the only ones detached from reality are the petitioners. They are not acting out of love. They are acting out of debt, desperation, and deception. I was called to the stand last. I took the oath, sat down, and looked directly at the judge. My voice did not tremble. I have lived in that house for 46 years. I have buried a wife, raised a son, taught thousands of students. I still remember every single line of Macbeth, and I still know how to wire a broken switch and make French toast the way Elaine liked it. I am not senile. I am not broken. I am angry, and I am allowed to be, because the people I loved most have tried to erase me before I'm even gone." I paused, looked at Calvin. "You told a man I wouldn't be a problem much longer, that you were waiting for my house, that I was slipping. But the truth is, I was watching. And now, so is the court." The judge deliberated for less than an hour. Her ruling was swift and merciless. The petition was denied with prejudice, meaning they could not file again. The court recognized the attempt as malicious, punitive, and financially motivated. She referred the matter to the district attorney for review under potential elder abuse statutes. Nadine leaned toward me and whispered, "That's rare. That's as good as it gets." When it was over, Calvin approached me outside. "Dad, wait," he said. His voice cracked. I thought we were helping." I turned to him, and for the first time, saw not my son, but the full consequence of his choices. "You weren't helping. You were preparing to bury me while I was still breathing." He tried to speak again, but I walked past him. I didn't need to hear more. That evening, I stood at the edge of my property, the house glowing behind me in the dusk, and felt something I hadn't in years: peace. Not because the war was over. It wasn't, not completely, but because I had survived the ambush. They had wanted to write my ending, but I had taken back the pen. It's strange what remains once the storm passes. You imagine some grand stillness, a cinematic silence where everything is washed clean and clarity settles like morning dew. But real endings don't come with trumpet blasts. They arrive quietly in the space where noise used to live. After the final hearing, after the courthouse emptied, and the legal documents were filed away in polished drawers, life didn't change in any grand, visible way. The house remained the same. The chairs still creaked in the same spots. The wind still dragged dust across the porch. But something inside me had shifted. and I could feel it every time I moved through a room and knew with absolute certainty that I was the only one left to guard it. I never heard from Calvin again. Not directly. There were no apologies, no letters, no offers of peace. I read in a local news brief that his business filings had lapsed, that his house in Mesa was officially listed in foreclosure, that a lien had been placed on one of Tasha's remaining accounts. I don't rejoice in that. I don't sit here rubbing my hands at their ruin, but I don't mourn it either. What we choose to build our lives upon will either hold or collapse, and they had built theirs on something rotten. I had tried once to show them the other way, but you can't guide someone who thinks you're in the way. Some nights I still sit in Elaine's old chair by the window and look out across the dark fields where we once planted tomatoes in the spring. The soil's gone dry now, but I keep the rows tilled out of habit. There's a comfort in patterns, even when no one else sees them. I talk to her sometimes, not in the way lonely people talk to ghosts, but in the way you speak to memory. Steady, soft, without expecting a reply. I tell her what happened. I tell her what I did. And I ask if she'd be proud, though I already know the answer. Elaine never mistook kindness for weakness. She would have done the same. The neighbors, those who had quietly watched the drama unfold from across fences and driveways, have changed in how they speak to me. There's a new respect, a caution even. They no longer treat me like someone fading. Now they greet me like a man returned from something brutal. Some of them drop off muffins or ask if I need anything from the store. I thank them, sometimes accept, but mostly I decline. I don't need much anymore, not in the way I used to. I still make my own coffee, read the newspaper at the table, fix things that squeak or leak or refuse to close properly. But I've also started writing again, not just lists or letters or complaints, but thoughts, stories, small reflections on what happens when people you raised turn into strangers who want your name on a deed more than your voice in a room. I've even started teaching again, in a way. A community college just outside town asked if I'd consider running a seminar for older adults. Literature, memory, grief. I said yes. I didn't realize how much I missed the way words land when spoken out loud. I read them passages from Baldwin, from O'Connor, from Dickinson and Frost. Sometimes I tell them what happened to me, not in full detail, but in hints, and I watch their faces tighten, not in confusion, but in recognition. Most of them have their own versions. It's a kind of quiet epidemic. What happens to people when they age and others begin planning their exit as if kindness were a courtesy and not a right? I made one last change, too. I updated my will again. I didn't erase Calvin completely. I left him something, not the house, not the accounts, but a letter. Sealed. It rests with the attorney to be delivered upon my passing. Inside, I wrote the only thing that felt honest. I told him I loved the boy he was. I mourned the man he became. And I forgave him, not for him, but for myself, so that whatever time I have left wouldn't rot under the weight of old hatred. I told him I hoped he learned something. I didn't tell him what. If he's smart enough to understand one day, he won't need me to spell it out. This isn't a happy ending, but It is mine, and in this house, in this body, with every breath I take, I remain the author of it. They said I should already be dead. But I buried their dreams instead, not out of malice, but out of necessity. And now I live, quietly, clearly, on my own terms.